There is a traditional technique of taking a picture with a telephoto lens, but handheld. And it's a technique that today is largely forgotten. Now, you might be in a situation where you can't use a tripod, they're not permitted perhaps, so therefore you've got to handhold. And this is where this very important technique comes into play, which is hardly out of date. I learned this technique when I started photography back in the 1960s when I joined the Dorking Camera Club. That's where I learned this technique from. What is it? Well, if, for example, you're using a telephoto lens with a focal length, and remember, these are the film days, by the way, 35mm film days. So if you're using a telephoto lens 400mm, then you used a shutter speed of at least a 400th of a second. And then, by hand holding, the picture should still be sharp. Now these days, we have, of course, on digital cameras, shutter priority. So, you set the shutter speed under shutter priority to a 400th of a second, and then the camera should choose the appropriate aperture for a correct exposure. What could be easier? Not quite, as we shall see in a moment. Hand holding a camera with a telephoto lens increases the risk of camera shake, causing an unsharp image. The reason for this is because you are magnifying optically the image. I've got here, this is the Olympus 12-100 Pro lens. 12-100, that is the focal length. It's an 8.5 times zoom. So if I just convert that into 35mm film focal lengths, we're talking from 24 wide angle through to 200 telephoto. So it's pretty powerful. Now, with this lens set on wide angle at 12 or 24 if you prefer, then as I go increasingly towards telephoto, the risk of camera shake causing an unsharp picture increases. However, with this particular lens, it has a built-in image stabilizer, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But the clear thing here to grasp is that the more powerful the telephoto end of, say, a zoom lens or a prime lens, then you are increasing the risk of an unsharp picture through camera shake because you are magnifying the picture. Full frame photographers, and indeed photographers still using 35mm film cameras, should have no difficulty in selecting the right shutter speed in accordance with the focal length of the lens. If, like me, and I've just shown this, you are using micro four thirds, then you just simply double the number, the focal length of the lens. So for 200mm, then you think of 400. If you are using some other format, then I'm afraid you might need a calculator to work it out. Telephoto lenses, either zoom or prime, are usually larger and heavier than other lenses. Now this can have a benefit. This lens I was showing you a moment ago is quite heavy, but when it comes to hand holding, then the sheer physical weight of this actually makes it easier. But there is another more important problem we have to consider. Now look, you're using a 400th of a second, and the amount of time which the light can reach the sensor has been dramatically reduced. And so what does the camera do? You're on shutter priority, it sorts out the aperture automatically, but because of the very short shutter speed, with me on this, the very short shutter speed, then the aperture in the camera cannot open wide enough to compensate. So what do you get? Yes, you get an underexposed image. And I'm afraid it doesn't stop there. Now, this should not be a problem in strong light, for example, a lovely sunny day. But when the level of light reduces significantly, say under a cloudy sky, like a day we have out there now, then the camera has either got to use a longer shutter speed or open up the aperture. But of course, we are controlling the shutter speed in order to handhold the camera. Now, I know one way out of this is to increase the ISO value, increasing the sensitivity of the sensor itself. I'm going to leave that to one side for the moment. I want to deal with shutter speeds and apertures only for the moment. But in order to understand the ongoing story, what I'm about to relate, you do need to understand and know the basics of photography, particularly in respect of shutter speeds and apertures. If the widest aperture on your telephoto lens, zoom or prime, is f2.8, even 1.8, then you can rejoice. Now, the lens I've shown you, the widest aperture on here is only f4, and we have a problem. Now, this is what we call a constant aperture lens. That is, the widest aperture of f4 is available over its entire zooming range. It is quite likely that your lens does not have that advantage, even if it's f2.8, because it might be what we call a variable aperture lens. That is to say, as you zoom from wide angle through to telephoto, what might have been factor 2.8 at the wide angle end gradually goes down to as much as 5.6 at the other end, therefore reducing the amount of light reaching the sensor significantly. So we have a problem, don't we? So if you have a variable aperture lens and you are perhaps on safari or at a sports meeting where you cannot get close to the subject, you want to freeze the action, then if you are losing as much as 2 whole stops between wide angle and telephoto, then getting a sharp picture by hand holding is a problem. There is, of course, constant aperture lenses. Now, the one I showed you a moment ago, the widest aperture is only f4. Now, I'm not a sports photographer. I use that for landscapes. But there are lenses out there where the aperture is much larger, something like f2.8 constant aperture. But those lenses are very heavy and expensive. In explaining how to handhold a telephoto lens, and particularly of a moving subject that is some distance away, an athlete or a wild animal, then a traditional knowledge of photography is extremely important. You cannot hope to succeed by just simply having the camera on auto. You've got to understand real photography. Now, if you wish to go down that road, and I'm giving you a link top right hand corner of the screen, then look at my program Back to Photography. That deals with things like shutter speeds, apertures, and a lot of other things, other matters that might help you, particularly if you want to enter the arena of specialist photography. In my own area of photography, landscape and architecture, then perhaps hand-holding a camera with a powerful telephoto lens is not so important. But imagine for a moment the poor sports photographer having to freeze action on a dull day. They probably will have a monopod to help them, but they would also have these huge lenses, which are probably factor 2.8 or 1.8 constant aperture lenses to help them, which of course are extremely expensive. Of course, if nothing else works, you can increase the ISO, which I leave to the last resort because my publishing clients do not like photographs with high ISO values. But with my own kit, of course, I have another advantage, and that is, as I mentioned earlier, the lens I showed you. Remember this one? It has image stabilization in it, and so does the camera I use, and so the two can work together, and that has saved me on many occasions. I hope you find this chat helpful. The important thing to remember above everything else is that as you go from wide angle to telephoto on your zoom lens, or chop and change lenses, go from wide angle to telephoto, you are increasing the risk of camera shake if you are hand holding, and there are ways around this without having to use a tripod, because you can't use one or they are not permitted. And of course the answer is something I learned something like 60 years ago, and it's still, guess what? Yes, relevant today.